Hey everyone, in this Capture One tutorial I'm going to take you through the Capture tab. I'm also going to show you one of my favorite techniques for shooting product photography in general, and that is using live view. As a product photographer who tends to shoot quite complicated objects which require light to be in really specific positions, I find live view to be probably one of the most indispensable tools that I have. We're going to cover that in a minute, but first we're going to go over the Capture tab, so let's go straight to Capture One. As always, our adjustment tabs are on the left hand side of Capture One over here, and we can find the Capture tab right there with the little camera symbol. If you missed my last episode, that was taking you through the library tab, and the one before that was a quick overview of navigating around Capture One in general. So if you missed those, I'll link to them above. Make sure you check them out before you watch this one. Now, the Capture tab is where we have all the settings that control the camera itself. So I'll just go through them one by one, and then we'll go on to live view, which, as I said, is one of my favorite things to do. So first things first, we have exposure evaluation. It gives us a little histogram kind of representation of the image. So if I brighten this particular image up, you'll see that it'll change and the histogram will go over. Obviously the image is quite dark, you could say quite underexposed as well. It's not really lit correctly yet, so the majority of the histogram data is over on the left hand side. And then the next part we have inside the Capture tab is next capture naming. This is so useful. There are so many things that you can do with this, but what I'm going to do for the moment is take you through one particular scenario. So just like in our last video, I'm going to imagine that we're on a shoot abroad somewhere rather than in my flat in London. We're somewhere glamorous and nice and warm, and we're shooting some models and some clothes. We're doing like 15 shots a day, multiple day shoot. So we've created, just like in the last session, the last tutorial, we've created a few folders inside our Capture folder for the different looks that we're creating. If we were actually doing this, those folders might be named something specific, which the brand is letting you know about, but for our purposes, they're just going to be named look 1, 2, and 3. So let's go back over here. So back to the library tab, and we can see I've already got everything created here and favorited. You can see the little heart symbol there, and they're appearing inside our session favorites. So the default for next capture naming is image name and camera counter. I believe that's correct. I had to add these in because it was already changed, but I can just quickly check that. So if I just quickly make a new blank session, and we'll see what they appear as here. Oh, so it's name and then camera counter. That's the default. So if we just go back to our recently opened session, which is our test one here. Load that up. And there we go. So next capture naming, what you can do is you can add what's called tokens in this area here, and they can reference various different things about your images. So let me just do a couple now. At the moment it's set to image name and camera counter. You can have presets set up here, and this gives you a little sample of what your image is going to be called. And there are tons of different tokens here. You can use so many different things. Realistically though, you're not really going to use that many. For our purposes now, I want to have a couple things. One thing, I want to have a name which references the folder we're shooting in. So if we've created all these different folders for different looks, I want to have the start of my name be that folder. So whether it's look 1 or autumn winter 18 underscore red, blah, I don't know, whatever, dress. And then after that, underscore a counter. So it would be the name of the shot, underscore 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 as we shoot new images. So to do so, what we want to do is drag in destination folder name. You can double click on it and that'll appear there. We then add an underscore and then go to digit counter here. You can have either 1 digit counter, 2, 3, 4, 5, or 6. I very much doubt you're going to shoot more than 9,999 images, which would be the 5-digit counter. So I think that should be enough. So we add that and then click OK. And you'll see at the moment it gives us a sample of output 00004. which is fine. This is what we wanted. So if I'm going back here in our session favorites, we have our first look. If I right click on that and go set as our capture folder, you'll see the little symbol there appears, and we know it's now set as the capture folder. If I capture an image now, Control or Command K, we'll see the image jump in here. There we go. And all the settings haven't been applied, but we can see there is our new image, and it's now called look1_0004. Now the reason it's 0004 is because while I was getting this tutorial ready, I would have captured a few of these images and I did not reset the counter. So if you click this little button here, you can reset the capture counter. And if I capture it again, what we'll now see is look 0001, hopefully. Yeah, there we go. So we have look 1. Now if I keep capturing images, you'll see this is quite slow. If you remember from the last videos, I'm using the A7R II to tether here, and that obviously it's a 42 megapixel camera, creates really big files, and it only has USB for tethering, so it's very slow to tether. You can see as you capture an image, you see the little colored line around here. That denotes that you've got something coming in, there's something being ingested into the computer. But as you can see, they've all continued with the look 1, 005, 4, it's all gone along in order there. This one, I wasn't actually paying attention. That's because there was already a look 4, so it's automatically done _1. But so then if we change to our next look, let's say we're now moving on to the next shot, we right click on that and go set as capture folder and just do the same thing. So I'll just capture 2, 3 images with this painfully slow tethering, and we can see again they start to come in. The interesting thing to note here though is even though we've changed our capture folder, the actual digit counter at the end is still going from what we had in look 1. So if we go back to look 1, we'll see the last one was 05, first one in look 2 is 06. Now if we change to look 3, but let's say we don't want it to, the digit counter to roll over, we want it to start from 01 again, then what we just do is go back over here and go reset capture counter, capture 1 now, and the first one will start with 1 rather than following on from the digit from the last one. There we go, 01. So that's really simple but extremely useful. If you need to reset the counter from up here as well, you can do that here. You can go File, Edit, Counters, and then reset the capture counter there as well. You can also set up a shortcut to change the capture folder. So rather than just right clicking on it and going set as capture folder, you can actually set up a shortcut. So here in the file menu we have set as capture folder. You can set that as a shortcut by going edit keyboard shortcuts and creating your own shortcuts. I'm not going to show you how to do that now, but you can do it and it does speed up the process significantly. Heading back over to the capture tab, our next section is next capture location, and all this is going to be is it just denotes where the next images are going to be going to. So as you know, at the moment our look 3 folder is the capture folder, and we can see the next capture location is look 3. If I change this, the next if I set look 2 as the capture folder, then we'll see here this changes to look 2. So that's pretty self-explanatory. The next section we have next capture adjustments. So let's we can leave it on look 2. I'll just capture an image and we'll see that being ingested over here in a moment. There we are. And you see how it's all getting a bit confused now because I've not reset the counter each time. And the images are coming in a different order. That's because at the moment they're organized by name. If I organize them by date, then the latest one will come down here, but it's still a bit of a confusing thing because we've gone back to look 2 and we've got the wrong counter. So it's kind of up to you, personal preference, whether you want to reset the capture counter or just have it running the whole time. I think personally I would just have it running the whole time, and if there were gaps, if you were moving between looks, it wouldn't really be an issue. So anyway, the next capture adjustments is very simple. All it means is that as you apply adjustments within Capture One, you're telling it whether you want those adjustments to be applied to the next image you're capturing or not. So over here, we can have it here as default set to copy from last. And that is going to be what you're going to use most of the time. So if I change some settings here, let's change the white balance. So if we just zoom in, zoom in onto something white, and I'll just set that now, roughly like that. And then let's also add a little bit of clarity, and then turn on our exposure warning up here, and just pull in the highlights a little bit, just until they start to clip. Bit of lightness on levels. Take this down. It doesn't really matter what I'm doing now, I'm just doing this to show you guys. But let's see, I've added these adjustments. So we've gone from something that looked like that to this. If I take a photo, then what's going to happen is those adjustments are going to be applied to that next photo. So you'll see it come up now. And there it is, those adjustments are applied there. And that works the same with crop or any other adjustments that you add. The other settings we have inside Next Capture Adjustments are ICC profile, orientation, metadata, and then all other. In general, I just leave all of these on the default. I've not had many instances where I've needed to change the ICC profile for the next image that's being captured. The only one I do need to change sometimes is the orientation. If you're changing the camera position and we're still shooting, then you might need to change it from the default, especially if you're shooting overhead or in another kind of way where Capture One may not necessarily ingest your image in the way that you'd want to. Moving on to the next section within the Capture tab, we have the camera. So in camera, everything is going to be a little bit different depending on what manufacturer you're using. So I often shoot in Capture One with Canon, I've shot with Nikon in it for years, and I now shoot with Sony. Each one behaves a little bit differently. I don't exactly know how software is designed, but I believe it's something to do with the manufacturers being able to give as much information as possible to Phase One and Capture One. I'm not really sure. Regardless of the reason, they all behave a little bit differently, and they're all going to have slightly different options for what you're going to be able to do. That's both within this part, so in the camera section where you're changing things, in another section where we can see all of our camera settings, and within live view. They're all going to be slightly different, and that may even vary from camera to camera of the same manufacturer. So if you have a different camera from Nikon, let's say you have a D810 and you have a older or lesser high-end model like a D3200, I think. I'm not sure which models Nikon has. Or say you have a Canon 60 or a Canon 5D Mark IV or the A7R III or the A7R. They're all going to be a little bit different. So just bear that in mind if you're going, why is this not working for me and it was for him? Or why is it different when I move from Canon to Nikon? They are all a bit different. So here, anything that's grayed out, we can't change. So I can't change this. This denotes, as you'd expect, that we're shooting in manual exposure mode. I can't change that. On some camera manufacturers, you will be able to change these kind of things. Otherwise, we have all this obvious stuff, ISO, shutter speed, aperture. If you don't know what that is, then I'm sure you can find some tutorials online, but I'm not going to cover all that right now. And then we have some other settings here for like Kelvin and whether we're shooting in RAW or JPEG or whatever. Those are the settings that Sony gives me on the A7R Mark II, but they will be different for different manufacturers. I'm going to go into live view in a moment, which we access by hitting this button, but I'm going to leave that till last. If you want to capture a photo, you can use that button. You could also click up here on this button up here to capture a photo. And finally, you can use the keyboard shortcut Command or Control K. All of those will capture a photo. Our next controls are camera focus. For my A7R II, these tend to be grayed out. I don't believe they will work. I don't think they do on here. Sony have a separate app which I use on the A7R III, which allows me to have control over this sort of stuff. But I know on Canon this works. On Nikon, I don't think it worked on my D810, but I'm not sure. Essentially, you can adjust the focus. So near and far, you can move it either in larger increments, slightly less, or very small increments. And you can also use autofocus, depending on where you have your focus point set. Next we have camera settings. Like I said before, this will vary wildly depending on manufacturer, how much you have here. For Sony, let me just pull this out, there isn't actually that much. For Canon and Nikon, there are tons of things here, but this just gives you a lot of information about what you have, how you have your camera set up. I don't really tend to dive in there very often, but it's nice to have it. Next we have overlay. This is an extremely useful tool where you can overlay either text or an image over the top of your photo here, and then use that for compositional purposes or for all sorts of things. So I really quickly mocked up an utterly rubbish magazine cover, which is basically just some text, which I just did in Photoshop very quickly. And I saved that as a PNG inside Photoshop so it can maintain transparency. If you don't know what that is, it basically just means that if I have a transparent background, it's going to maintain that so that we can see the image through here. Now, inside of overlay, you can select this hand tool, which allows you to move it around. You can also change the opacity of it. So if I have it, at the minute it's at 50% opacity. If I take that up to 100, you can see how it's now blocking the image through there. Let me just zoom in so you can see this properly. So 0%, you can't see anything, and then you can just slowly fade it up. This is really useful if you just want to see a small amount of the preview versus have it completely blocking your image. We can then scale it, so we can have it bigger or smaller, and we can adjust the position using these controls, horizontal and vertical, rather than using the hand tool here, which is a little bit more precise. So that's it for overlay. It may not seem like the most powerful tool, but it is extremely useful if you're working, say for example, if I was doing a still life shoot and I had an art director coming along who was working for a magazine and they had a set magazine headline and they had the front cover already set up and ready to go. We just needed to create the image and they wanted it to be really specifically composed to fit all the typography and everything they've done already. And we could then load that up as a PNG, work together and make sure that everything's going to look great and they can have a preview of their magazine front cover right there and then during the shoot. It's also really useful if, say, for example, you're doing e-commerce photography and you want to perfectly match an image, the placement and composition that you've done before. You can then load that image up as a JPEG. You don't need to worry about the transparency then, and then just use opacity to make sure that you're lining everything up. There's lots of good uses for it. You can even use it in live view, which I'll show you again in a second. Other than overlay, the next thing we have in this menu is something called Capture Pilot. Now I must be honest and say I've never used this. It sounds extremely useful, but for me I've never had a need to use it. Essentially what Capture Pilot does is you can get a preview of the images that you're capturing on an external device. So say you have an iPad or somebody's phone and you've got some members of the crew, rather than them being crowded around your computer as images are coming in, they can be looking at the iPad or they can be looking at whatever it is they're looking at, whatever device it is, and they can see images coming through. They can also rate images and do all sorts of other things. If you want to see more of an in-depth tutorial on Capture Pilot, then just have a Google. There's quite a few out there already. I can try and find one and link to it in the description for you. So now we can move on to my favorite part of this, and that is by far live view. So if I click live view now, what we're going to see is a live representation of our image up here. So it opens up a new window. I can expand that out and we can see our image here. So this is what my A7R2 is seeing right now. Now immediately, the most obvious thing is that the orientation is wrong. So let's just change the orientation over here. I think 270 is the right one, and I'm just going to hide the overlay as well because we don't need to see that right now. So I'm just going to untick show. I'm also going to turn on all of my lights so that we can get a slightly better view of this. There we go. Now I've turned on all the lights, as you can see here. Unfortunately, I have a couple video lights as well, which are kind of interfering with this, but now we can get a really good idea of what each one of our lights are doing within this scene. Now, before I show you this element, I'm just going to take you through all of our live view controls, and then I'll show you how I love to use it. Again, it's important to note here that for each camera manufacturer, you're going to get a different amount of controls that you're able to do here. Sony sadly does not have that many, so it's a little bit difficult for me to show you them all. They do have their own app which you can run simultaneously to Capture One, which is what I do, but just for our purposes now, I'm not going to show you that app. I'm just going to demonstrate everything inside of Capture One. But just bear in mind, if you're using Canon or Nikon or Phase One, you're going to have a different amount of controls here. So let's just start up here. We have the live view navigator up here, which is fairly self-explanatory and obvious. We can also change our orientation. I believe lightness and quality you have for Phase 1 cameras. I don't have anything I can do here on Sony. And also camera focus. I think I am in manual focus right now, yeah. If I go to autofocus, we'll see if that changes. No, that does not change on Sony cameras. So that is not a function that we can use. So I just tried changing a couple more settings on the Sony camera to see if I could get that to work, but sadly not. AF does seem to work. You have to set the position on the actual camera and then it'll autofocus to that position, but really this isn't very useful for Sony cameras. For Canon and Nikon and Phase 1 obviously this is extremely useful. What you can do is you can use either the hand tool or the zoom tool up here, and you can actually zoom in to your image. On Sony, what it does is it just sees what the camera is at the moment, so I can zoom in and just show you what it's like. So as you can see, I've now zoomed in on the actual back of the camera of the Sony. I can pan around and I can move it here. With other camera manufacturers, like I've said, you could actually just do that using the hand tool and or the zoom tool, and then you can adjust focus using these settings, which is really useful, especially if you're shooting very high up, for instance, and you can't easily access the camera. So helpful. Live view info is something that is related to Phase 1 backs, so again it's not going to help you unless you have one of those cameras. Then we have our focus meter. This one's quite cool. So you can use this tool and then you can select either one point or multiple points, and then as you change the focus on your camera, it'll tell you how in focus that point is. So let me just roll the barrel on my lens here, and you can see that display changing. As the orange bars go closer to the other bar, that is telling me how good the focus is. So that would be almost perfectly in focus. And if we set another point, let's say I want to see that point back there, that tells me that the point number 2, which we can see here, is not as in focus as point number 1. So again, if I change this, you can see we can switch between the two of them. So that's quite useful. It's not something that I use all that much, but it is a nice feature to have should you need it. So let's move on to, let's get rid of these. Just hit X next to each one. And let's move on to the next part. So the next bit is the overlay. So just as we saw before, it acts in exactly the same way. You can just see it during live view, so you can adjust things during live view to make the composition that much easier to do. So let me just hide this again now, and the next parts that we have up here, we have show the overlay. We can show grids in here as well. We can change it from being RGB to being black and white, so just showing you a black and white preview, which can be quite nice. And we also have a depth of field button. This is going to be different for Canon and Nikon. One of them has an exposure preview button, one of them has depth of field. This doesn't actually work for Sony, so I can't show you anything. But now let me show you what I think is one of the greatest things about live view. So as I said at the beginning, as a product photographer, I shoot some very complicated things, and my lights have to be in really specific positions to get the correct look. Now, as I've been shooting this tutorial, I've knocked my tripod multiple times, lights have gone out of alignment, and especially the backlight, as you might be able to see there, is not quite in the middle. So if I want to get that in the middle, if I wasn't using live view, I'd have to move the light a little bit, take a photo, move the light a little bit, take a photo, move the light a little bit, take a photo, until it was perfect. Using live view, I can just look at the screen as I move the light. Let me demonstrate. So if I can make sure that if I can make sure I am just out of shot, then I can move the light which I have just below me here, and I can see exactly where that's going to be placed correctly. It's a little bit tricky with this image for me to be out of the shot. But you can see that light at the back moving there. I can say roughly there is about the right position. Now I'm currently working off a very small laptop, so it's quite hard for me to have actually seen what I was doing from back there. But if I was working with a larger screen, it's so much easier to do this in a studio. But as we can see here, this light is placed almost perfectly. And if I capture an image, we can see how it moves. There we go. So it's gone from there to there. It's not positioned perfectly still, but it's a lot better than it was. That's it for the Capture tab and for Live View inside of Capture One. This was a pretty short video, but hopefully you don't underestimate the power of using Live View and of all these naming tokens that I've shown you. If you have any questions, chuck them in the comments. Happy to answer anything you have. If you want to see more from me, make sure you hit subscribe so you don't miss future videos, and hit thumbs up if you like this video. Alright guys, thanks for watching. I'll catch you later.